Triggers. Triggers are the mission maker's bread and butter. In the toolkit of the mission maker, your trigger is the entry level to understanding and being able to use a more varied and advanced set of skills, such as creating missions which would require conditions or things to be fulfilled in order for something else to happen. Essentially, a trigger, in the simplest form, is something causes the trigger to activate. Once the trigger is activated, it then does something else. And there you go, you've got a selection, you've got an if statement, you've got some way of causing one thing to occur because of another, which can be helpful if you, say, for example, want to create a task and have it complete upon a certain thing occurring, or, as I've done a little bit over here and over here, call a script or use indirect fire or artillery support or CAS support on a trigger. I'm going to go through today the very basics of how a trigger works, as well as some other important things that you would want to know. Okay, let's start us off with this test trigger here. We're going to go through each of the individual sections of this trigger, and I'm going to explain how they work and what you need to know about them as a mission maker. Your init section is the arguably most important part if you want this to be a more advanced piece of equipment for you. So you can actually do something called trigger chaining, or it's what I call trigger chaining anyway, but it's when you use one trigger to reference the outcome of a second trigger. We'll get onto that a little bit more in a little bit later on. But in order to do this, you need to give your trigger a variable name, as I've done here. Having a trigger with a variable name allows you to reference it because it creates a name that you can look at and reference later on at any point. The same is true of any object in this game. If you give it a variable name, you can reference it at a later date. Then you have your default transformation section, which is the part of every single object in this game. The things of note here is the size. Now the size equates to the size in the X and Y, as well as the Z axis of your trigger. So this is 5 wide by 5 tall, and also by 5 in length. If I put it into a square here, or a rectangle, you should be able to see that it is exactly 5 meters by 5 meters and then 5 meters tall again. Moving on then, we have our activation. Now this is one of the two ways to activate a trigger, the other being the condition itself. When the condition says this in expression, you're actually looking at the activation section. So whatever the activation is in here will be what activates the trigger. So in type, you can have specific types of specific use cases. Skipping waypoints is usually one of the two things you use most, the other one being end or lose. Where a skip waypoint essentially means that when the trigger is activated, it will allow a waypoint that's synced to it to be skipped by the unit that's in that has that waypoint in its connection. As an example here, I'm going to place down this auto rifleman, and I'm going to give him a hold waypoint, which is going to be just here. Well, there you go. We'll go a hold waypoint, and then we'll also put a move waypoint down as well, if I can get to click it in quick enough. Come on. There we go. Right. If I were to sync this waypoint with the waypoint activation to the hold marker and then a skip waypoint and the type, that would allow this otherwise unescapable waypoint, where that EAA will be stuck forever, to then be bypassed, and we can then let it continue on with its day. Moving on. On our activation section here, we have the generic conditions for activating the waypoint, whether that be a certain presence of a player or anything, or blue fort for independent, or whether it's a radio channel, which is your 008 key. If you look at the support menu, you'll see it in there. Or whether it be seizing it. The difference between something being present and something being seized is how strong the forces are in that area. When you're looking for a seize activation, it would have to be an overwhelming amount of force by the size that you're wanting to look for seizing it. So for example, if you have both Op4 and Blue4 in the same area, in order to be seized by Blue4 would have to outnumber Op4 by a extraordinary amount. If there's tanks, as you can see there, it generally counts more tickets or more indications of strength. So if there's one tank, you would have to have 4 or 5 Blue4 infantrymen to equate to being overwhelming force. For most purposes though, when it comes to activation, you're probably likely to use the any player, blue 4, opt 4 or independent, or even civilian activations. Once you've selected one of these, I'm going to go ahead and select any player, you can then check the type of activation, whether they're present, whether they're not present, or whether they've been detected by a given side. Detected means that they're in the area and they also have been spotted or being shot at by a side that is also in the area. So if a blue 4 operative was inside the 5x5 trigger or nearby the 5x5 trigger and had seen the player when they're inside the trigger or around the trigger, that would then count as detected. Present and not present, I believe, is pretty self-explanatory. We then have our repeatable ticket. Essentially what this does is it activates the ability to use on deactivation, because otherwise the trigger will not deactivate. If a trigger is not repeatable, i.e. it has not got this box ticked, the trigger will activate and then will stay activated. It won't deactivate again. In order to make it repeatable, it must be deactivatable, which is why we click this box here, at which point this becomes an option as well, which we'll get to in a minute. Speaking of in a minute, we have our condition, our expression section. This is important for people who are wanting to use other conditions that are not covered in activation here. You can make specific conditions which will allow for greater control over when the trigger fires and how it fires. For example, a little bit later on you'll see this example or something similar to this, which is a custom condition which only will fire when the object, which is called man, is no longer alive. There's a video about kill triggers which goes into this in extreme depth. Essentially what happens is, whenever an activation, such as any player being present or a condition is activated, the trigger is activated, and then on activation section will fire. This could be anything from just having a hint that pops up to actually calling some line of code like a script, which I'll show you in a minute. If the trigger is repeatable, you can also have on deactivation as a line of code as well, which could then trigger something or provide a hint in this case when the player is no longer present in the zone. If we're using this example here, the player will enter the zone and they'll trigger the I'm in hint, and when they leave the zone you'll get the trigger hint down here. Moving on then, we have our trigger timers and our trigger effects. Now the trigger timer is essentially a part of two different methods. The countdown will activate the conditions of the trigger, or the activation section of the trigger here, or anything that's synced to when the countdown has been reduced to 0. So it'll count down from whatever you give it in seconds, so for example 60 seconds here, all the way down to 0. And then upon reaching 0, the code will execute, or whatever you synced to the trigger will execute. Timeout is the opposite. Essentially, in order for this trigger to work, you'd have to reach the conditions of the trigger before the time expires. So, for example, after 60 seconds, if I'm not in the trigger, the timeout would have reached it and the trigger is no longer able to be used. Finally, we have our effects. Our effects are the simplest part on here. We have sound, which can be executed. We have voice, we have environment effects, we have sound effects, there's music, and there's an overlay you can play. All these things are possible to apply to a player when they're inside of a trigger, or an object when they're inside of a trigger, or anything. As soon as the trigger is activated, these effects will also activate. It's worth noting that most of the time these will be applied globally. You have to specify certain particular people to apply on if you want it to be more specific than that. Okay, and with that, that brings us to the end of the trigger overview. I'm going to go through the remainder of the special things you can do in a moment. Okay, moving on then, we have some examples here of a enabled repeatable trigger, which would show to us a player has been detected and then when the player has left the trigger. This is actually possible because of the repeatable tag here. I've also done the same for blue 4 and ot 4. You'll note when we start playing the game in a little while, I will be detected by this player, or by this trigger rather, and by this trigger, not by the third trigger, because I am a blue 4 unit. I am also a player, I am not an ot 4 unit. So only these two triggers will fire. Okay, so here's our test. We're going to run through all three of these triggers. We should get the on activation and the on deactivation message for each, which will show that we are present inside the trigger and what we're being detected as. Let's give it a go. There we go, player presence has been detected. We've left the player presence trigger, blue 4 presence has been detected, and we've left the blue 4 presence trigger. You'll note that because we are blue 4 unit, we are not detected by this ot 4 trigger. Moving a little bit on to conditions or advanced conditionals. We can do a number of things when it comes to triggers which can be helpful. For example, we can do an or statement in our triggers. We have two men here. We have second trigger 2 and second trigger 1 as variable names for these two lovely gentlemen here. And in this trigger, we are checking to see whether this man is alive or this man is alive. The two horizontal bars means an or statement. And on activation, we have the or example trigger has been activated. So we will know that when this target has been killed or this target has been killed, this system chat message will pop up to say that that has occurred, and it will also complete the associated task, which is to test the simple or trigger. Furthermore, I've also linked a flare onto it, which should show you that when this trigger is completed, this synced flare module will be able to fire and should be visible above us in the sky. The alternative to having an or statement is an and statement, which is when both the man on the left here and the man on the right here are dead, the trigger will fire. If I kill either one of these two people, that won't occur. I have to kill both of them in this case. And as same as before, we have a create task to test the simple and trigger, which will be completed once this trigger has activated, as well as the flare behind it will go up into the sky. Moving on then, we have our two conditional statements. So here we have our or statement trigger, which is over here, crazy looking around. And we're going to kill either one of these two gentlemen, and the trigger will activate. There we go, the or example trigger has been activated, the flare has gone up into the sky, and we have the completion of the task. We can kill the other guy if we want, but it's not going to change the trigger, it's not going to reactivate it again. The reason it's not going to reactivate it again is because there is no repeatable trigger on this one. You could use this for killing a certain number of rocket launcher sites or HVTs in an area, whatever you'd like to do with it. You now have the tools to be able to create a almost complete murder of people. The same is true of these and people over here. I now have to kill both of these people for this trigger to activate. So you could do the same with high value targets. You have to kill both of these high value targets before the trigger for killing them activates. And there's our second flare. In front of us now we have two more advanced triggers. Essentially these combine our simple triggers to create a choice of sorts. Now theoretically you could combine and reorganize the different conditionals, I've only gone over two, to create any sort of condition that you want in your trigger. But this is a very simple advancement which should allow you to make a choice between killing one person or killing two people. I'm using the barricade here as an illustrative point. It shows the physical choice between having our single man dead, which is a target advanced trigger 6, and target advanced trigger 4 and 5 dead. Going into the trigger then. Here we have our two targets on the left hand side of the barricade, and they are linked with an AND. So it checks to make sure that this target is dead as well as this target. And if that's true, the trigger will fire. Otherwise, because of the OR, it checks to make sure that advanced trigger man 6 is dead. And if that's true, it fires. So either these two people have to be killed, or this single person has to be killed before the trigger will fire. And that's because of the AND statement between 4 and 5, and the OR statement between this half on the left-hand side of the OR statement and this half of the condition. The brackets I put in to make it a little bit more visually appealing and easier to understand. You don't have to put them in, although I do recommend it for your own sanity, especially when you're making more advanced triggers or conditions. I've also duplicated this so that you can see both outcomes to this trigger working when it comes to live. We are in front of the advanced conditionals that we talked about a moment ago. If you remember, both sets of these individuals in front of us are wired up to almost identical triggers. In fact, they are identical, except for they're referencing different people. They're referencing the people linked to them. So these triggers should allow us to choose between killing the people on the left-hand side of the sandbag and the people on the right-hand side of the sandbag. If you remember, these two are linked via an AND statement, so I have to kill both of these people for the trigger to fire, or I could kill this person for a trigger to fire. Let's demo that by killing the person on the right first. As you can see, we've activated this trigger. If I then kill the people on the left, nothing will happen because the trigger isn't repeatable. If I flip though on the other side and I kill one person on the left-hand side of the sandbag here, nothing happens. Because in order for this trigger to fire, I had to kill both the people on the left-hand side. And as before, if I kill the person on the right, nothing happens. So this allows you to do a very simple choice. In this case, between killing two people or one person. So it's like a trolley problem, if you will. You could replace the alive statements with any of the other conditions that we have talked about before. Whether that be checking to see if an object is in a container or killing two people or something like that. That's up to you to work out in your missions, but that should give you the basic overview for some of the easiest conditions to get and work around. In front of us now we have a trigger owner activation trigger, which is a whole load of mouthful of words, but essentially all it means is that when you sync a trigger owner or a player's trigger owner from the connection bar here, whatever you sync that to as a trigger owner will be the only thing or group of things that can activate this trigger. So you could put civilians in here, you could put any other type of unit on the planet into this zone, and nothing will happen until that specific person or that group of people are in the zone. When you sync a trigger owner to a trigger, it changes the activation box so that you can select 4 new options, either the owner, the whole group of the synced party, the group leader only, or any group member from that group. So what that means is, if I were to change this to be the entire group or the whole group, and I had a second civilian and grouped it up to our first one, either one of these civilians could be present in the trigger and it would still activate as owner only. This is useful for when you want, for example, to take a high value target from one location to a second location, and you only want that civilian or that target or that high value target to activate the trigger. Or you only want a specific person from a player side to activate a trigger. Or you only want a specific unit or vehicle to activate a specific trigger. There's lots of different ways to utilize this. I'll leave it up to your imaginations. So we're in game now, and we have our eyes on the trigger owner activation we've got here. So if I walk into this zone, nothing will happen. If a civilian walks into the zone, nothing will happen. But once we take this lovely gentleman in, the trigger will activate. Don't worry about you seeing me use ace, it doesn't matter, this works without ace, or anything, any mod whatsoever. Okay, and there we go. We have our trigger activation next to the trigger flag. The trigger owner is inside the trigger, as you can see in the bottom left. Everything's groovy. You've seen how to affect things in the game. Now you can look at the scripting side of things. You can call scripts from triggers to do anything you like. At the moment, I have in my mission folder, I have a script called ascript.sqf. ascript.sqf activates this hint. It says you've called a script from the on activation of this trigger, and you could do anything you put your mind to with this before removing the hint from our screen. Now, when a player walks into this zone now, because it's any player present, we can now call that script using this fancy line of code. I'm using exec VM and a handle, which is what this is. You could use anything you like. You should use call or exec, anything you want to talk about. On the wiki for Arma 3, you can find a whole list of the different ways to call a script, and you can dive into that. That's not the point of this this particular environment, but the gist of it is when a player is present, it will call the script that's in my mission folder, which is this one right here, and we can see the result of that in game, which we'll see in a minute. Here's our script trigger. So we can move into this trigger, and we should be able to activate the script there within. The top right hint will be replaced by the you've called a script from the activation of this trigger that we had in our folder. So you can use this to do anything you like. You could use it to call and create an entire new squad of units from scratch. You could do that. You could do absolutely anything you wanted to do with this. It doesn't matter. The thing that's important to you now is now you know how to do it. The possibilities are limitless, and now it's up to you to work out what you want to do with it. I think it's time to trigger the last one. We've touched a very, very small amount upon syncing activations before. So this is the tour de grace, or whatever you call it, the show of power of this particular feature. This trigger doesn't do anything in activation. It doesn't do anything on deactivation. It doesn't even put music on. All it does is when the player is present, it activates everything that it's synced up to. Everything. So it completes this task. It also allows for the scheduling of waypoints and calling in artillery and IDF support. It pops this red smoke over here. It calls in a airplane to bomb the side of the hill on the red smoke. It also sets the waypoint activation of particular units. So something we haven't touched upon so much is waypoint activation. When you right click on the trigger, you can set the waypoint activation. What this does is it holds units at a waypoint, in this case for this hunter, or this MATV. It prevents the hunter from moving past this waypoint until this trigger is activated, at which point it will then go through the remainder of the waypoints and stop here. You can use this feature to perform ambushes as well. For example, there's a fire mission here, which leads all the way back to this lovely mortar position over here. This mortar position is stuck at this waypoint. It registers the artillery, and then it does nothing until the waypoint is activated by the player walking into this trigger, at which point it can start firing at this location. This will be an unlimited barrage and it won't stop, but you can obviously time the waypoint. That will come in a different video. So, let's see how it works. You join us once more for the final trigger that we have to look at this evening. So, things to note so far before we begin. Over there you'll see no red smoke, you'll see no plane. You will however see the hunter, you can see its flashlights or headlights at least, holding at the waypoint that it requires this trigger to activate before it can continue. So, now we've seen that, let's go downstairs. And we can trigger this trigger here. So, the things to note here, you could use this in any way you like. You could use it to create an ambush. There's a video coming out soon about how I use a artillery piece and some vehicles to create an ambush using a single trigger, as well as some other interesting things you might find useful. This should be a pretty clear demonstration of the power of using a trigger with sync activations. Or code, it's up to you. Off we go. Okay, we've moved into the zone. We look around, we have our trigger activation. There's red smoke over there. Our hunter is approaching us. If you listen carefully, you can hear the mortar firing behind us, and in a moment we should have an attack. There we go. The mortar has started firing very heavily. We're actually getting slightly wounded. We look up and around my shoulder. Our lovely close air support has just engaged the position on the hill. And there we go. Synced activations at its finest, everybody. Oh, they're still firing. Alright then, well, I hope you enjoyed the video, everybody. I'm going to move slowly away from the explosions, as crippled as I am. And I hope that you tune in again for the next video. Next video should be about ambushes based upon triggers, or something similar. Till next time, everyone.